Discussions are extremely frank and informal, and the two go together, because if you're too formal, then sometimes you cannot be totally honest. I think the way it's organized, people really say their opinion. And Prime Minister Papandreou is encouraging that. He doesn't stifle discussion, he encourages it. So people can disagree, and people can be quite free in their disagreements. That's one very important part. The other important part is that there is a diversity. There are common values, but diverse opinions. And I think that is a good, the fact that you actually ask for diverse opinions is also a good thing. And then the fact that there's a core group that knows each other, that has followed events over the years, that can see sometimes what mistakes we've made in our own opinions and correct it. The continuity is also a good element. And then, of course, the fact that we can bring our families, that this is, the friendship is not just a professional one, but goes deeper into our families, into our children, into our partners, I think makes it very special.
For those of us who are in Greece for only a short time, Symi is a truly extraordinary opportunity to learn in some detail about what the present Greek government is doing and how it is attempting to cope with the economic crisis, with the financial difficulties, with the extraordinary external pressures that are on.
It's been a voyage of discovery, discovering Greece, geographically, politically, culturally. But also, I think, together, we've developed our own intellectual perspective.
You really need that additional perspective because you're so caught up in how things are going on in your own country, and then when it comes to other countries, you read the official statements and you meet with people, but to get together with, you know, the Prime Minister of Greece and Nobel Prize winner in economics, Joe Stiglitz, and to discuss what's going on is, I must say, one of the most dazzling experiences intellectually one could have.
But this year is special because it's a year that is very important for Greece, very decisive for Greece's economy, for creation of jobs and a good future. So this time we really hope that we can bring some of our experiences to bear on the many difficult choices that Greece faces.
It's also a possibility for all of us to discuss and enjoy ourselves and get new friends, networking from all leaders, and of course, as I am among young leaders.
I am from the Balkans. I work here. Greece is the principal and richest Balkan country. And this year, I would say, it has been particularly interesting for us to see how Greece is coping not only with the global economic crisis, but also with deep structural reforms. And I think that the example that Greece is giving us of this macro and structural deep-seated reform is very inspiring.
So, for example, at the opening session here at the 13th Symi, we had a discussion from Joe Stiglitz about the nature of the crisis, and then we had interventions from Leif talking about how he managed this in Sweden, and from Kemal about how he worked with the banks in this equivalent crisis in '91 in Turkey, and he told us how he had got the advice from Mexico about the need to communicate, and then we all came in with the larger discussions about the politics of that. So you have a real issue of developing new ideas, which I think we are now beginning to see influencing policy in Greece, mixed with real experience from the major policymakers about what they have achieved and what lessons they've learned, and then coming together in this big exploration of how we create a more sustainable and democratic world.
Well, I always come to Symi to learn a lot of things. I prefer to, not to speak so much, but to listen, because you have such a great audience of people that you usually read in the newspapers or see on CNN or so. And here you have them assembled, listening to each other and discussing together the programs of our world. And there's so much, that we share, although the countries are different. There's so many similarities that we face together, the challenges. So I believe this is really a great thing. And I always admired Yorgo Papandreou for doing that. And let's have in mind, he did that as well when he was Deputy Foreign Affairs Minister. He did it when he was Foreign Affairs Minister. And you can imagine it was not easy for him, to find the time to participate in such an event, and he does it still as opposition leader and hopefully next Prime Minister of Greece. I could imagine that it would be also good for other, prominent politicians around the globe to have such kind of meetings where they invite politicians, but not only politicians, have in mind researchers, journalists, experts, and just sitting there as a politician and listening to them and hearing their, concerns at itself is a good thing. So I believe it's good to be here and learn from the kind of discussions here. And I can tell you as a politician, I try to translate what I hear here into my daily politics.
Of the level of the people, it's really first-class people. The depth of the debates, the fact that things are very concrete. They are not a kind of a general debate about many things, but we are trying to be very concrete and try to draw lessons from each one's experience. And it is not a very big meeting. I mean, the meeting is limited to a small, relatively small number of people whom a present company excluded are on a very, very high level. So it is very, very interesting.
I think Symi is a wonderful place to exchange ideas, to learn, and I'm very pleased of how serious the whole ecological question is taken in Symi. So Symi can take credit for many things, not necessarily for who is the next executive director of Greenpeace.
This is my 6th Symi Symposium, and I have found it, as always, very stimulating, very innovative in terms of the thinking, as well as this one is somewhat historic in many ways for me, because this Symi Symposium is happening at a time when there is a coming together of various crises in the world.
Which big role energy companies play in the climate debate. And different from the past when they mostly did behind the scenes lobbying, they now occupy the public space. They say we are concerned about climate change, but their action actually is quite different. If you take big companies like Shell and BP, they actually are different from 4 or 5 years ago. They had moved quite a bit to renewable energy. They've moved out of it and gone into tar sands, for example, a very, very dirty way of gaining oil. If everyone would admit as much CO2 as the Americans do, our climate problem would be 6 times the size that it is now. If everyone would eat as much fish as the Japanese do, we would have to fish 10 times more fish than we do now. Already now we are overfishing, so that's completely unrealistic. If everyone had as many cars as a typical European has, then instead of 750 million, we would have 4 billion cars in the world. What you can easily, there's sort of 2 wrong conclusions which people do. In the Western world, people often say, the problem is too many people, it's the Chinese, it's the Indians. Sometimes in China or in other places, people would say, it's overconsumption. But the reality is, it's the product of both. And we can't have a future where everyone leads the kind of destructive consumption which we sometimes enjoy in the Western world with an ever-increasing world population. And that points to the real challenge of sustainability, and it will show itself in increasing water problems, in the question of how do we produce food, the competition, for example, do we use food also to produce biofuels, and how do we need more grain in order to produce more meat. So we face for the first time in human history the limits, the fact that we live on a big, beautiful planet. For the first time we realize the limits, and the limits influence us as civilizations.
That on the global scene, the United States disappeared because the crisis came from America, came from Wall Street, came from the American banks that were just before on top of the world. They decided everything, and they were the most well-paid gurus of the world. And suddenly they just disappeared. And the stage was empty, the spotlights were on, waiting for somebody else to enter the stage. Where was Europe? I think it was a great disappointment that Europe was not able to enter the stage and shoulder the responsibility of global leadership. A united Europe, a cooperating Europe should do it. But we failed, and that is a great disappointment.
So when you have a crisis like this, it's a big crisis. If you want to describe it in a funny way, you could say it's a catastrophic good crisis, and a good crisis is a terrible thing to squander and waste. We have two options here. We can either treat the crisis purely as a short-term measure, purely to try to do some small things to just get us out of the crisis and then continue as business as usual. Or we can say, given that we got ourselves in this crisis, how can we make sure that we never again are in the same crisis and put some bold thinking that actually rethinks democracy, rethinks the economy, rethinks the environment, and also fundamentally put people at the center of our deliberations, our policies, and our actions.